In 2004, an Australian pilot named Dave Shaw attempted a record-breaking dive beneath a tiny waterhole in the middle of South Africa's barren Kalahari Desert. A place where, hidden below the surface, lies a terrifying flooded cave plunging to a depth of 282 meters. The equivalent of a 9 four-story building, straight down into darkness.
He didn't just shatter multiple world records for cave diving. He stumbled upon something horrifying at the very bottom. The body of a young man who had been missing for 10 years. His name was Deon Dreyer, 20 years old, gone since 1994. And no one, not his parents, not rescue teams, not the best divers in South Africa, had ever been able to reach him. Dave looked at that body lying alone on the rock floor in absolute darkness at a depth where sunlight has never touched. And he made a promise to Deon's mother. "I will bring your son home."
I'm Leonard, 65. I've spent my life chasing stories across mountains, oceans, and deserts on every continent. I've seen courage, I've seen madness. I've seen the line between them disappear. But this story, what happened when Dave went back down to keep that promise on January 8, 2005, is the one that keeps me awake at night. Because the last image from his helmet camera shows his hands still gripping Deon's body bag even after Dave stopped breathing.
3 days later, 2 bodies floated up from the abyss together, side by side, as if the darkness itself decided to honor the promise that killed him. This is that story. Now tell me, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments. And if stories like this deserve to be told, hit subscribe, because the people in them deserve to be remembered. The northern Cape of South Africa is one of those places where the earth looks like it gave up trying.
The flat, cracked, endless. The Kalahari stretches out in every direction. Red dust, dry scrub, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring.
In October, the sun doesn't rise so much as assault you. By 8 in the morning, it's already 35 degrees. The air shimmers above the ground like a hallucination, and the only things moving are dust devils and the occasional hawk circling too high to cast a shadow. There is no reason for anyone to be here. And yet, about 50 kilometers down a dirt road from the nearest town, past cattle gates and thorn bushes that claw at your truck like hands, there is a hole in the ground. It's not impressive to look at, a few meters across, surrounded by gray limestone and dead grass. You could drive right past it and never know it was there. Some farmers in the area used it as a watering hole for livestock, others just ignored it entirely. But beneath that unremarkable opening lies one of the most terrifying places on Earth. They call it Bushman's Hut, Bushman's Hole. And what sits below that little crack in the desert floor is a flooded cavern so vast, so deep, that the first divers who explored it in the 1970s said it felt like sinking into a drowned cathedral. Sheer rock walls plunging straight down, columns of blue-green light filtering through the surface water above, then fading into nothing. And below that nothing, more nothing. All the way down to 282 meters. 282 meters. That's the height of the Eiffel Tower, pointed straight into the earth. At that depth, the water pressure is nearly 29 times what you feel standing on the surface. The nitrogen in your breathing gas turns into a narcotic. They call it the rapture of the deep. And it makes you stupid, giddy, confused. You start making decisions that will kill you, and you don't even realize it, because the nitrogen is telling you everything is fine. Oxygen becomes toxic. It can trigger seizures without warning. 1 second you're swimming, the next you're convulsing. Your regulator falls out of your mouth, and you drown before your brain understands what happened. And then there's the ascent. If by some miracle you survive the bottom, you can't just swim back up. You have to stop. Again and again and again. Decompression stops, they're called, hovering at specific depths for minutes, sometimes hours, while the dissolved nitrogen in your blood and tissues slowly works its way out. Rush it, and the nitrogen forms bubbles inside your veins. Paralysis, stroke, death. The total decompression time from the bottom of Bushman's Hole is somewhere between 12 and 14 hours. 12 to 14 hours, hanging in cold, dark water, alone with your thoughts and your breathing, and the knowledge that one malfunction, one miscalculation, one moment of panic, and you will never see the surface again. Only a handful of people on the planet have the technical ability and the nerve to dive below 200 meters. Below 250, you can count them on your fingers. Dave Shaw was one of those fingers. Born in 1954 in Australia, Dave was a commercial airline pilot, the kind of man who flew Boeing 737s and Airbus A320s across Asia and the Pacific with the calm, methodical precision that the job demands. Tall, lean, with the kind of weathered tan that comes from years of outdoor living rather than beach holidays. He had deep-set eyes that crinkled when he smiled, which was often, and a voice that carried an easy Australian warmth, the sort of voice that made you feel like everything was going to be all right, even when it wasn't. Dave started diving in his 40s, later than most technical divers, but he progressed at a speed that the diving community called extraordinary. By 2004, he had logged more than 333 deep dives and broken multiple personal and regional records. He was one of the world's leading cave divers using a rebreather system, a closed-circuit unit that recycles your breathing gas, allowing you to go deeper and stay longer than conventional scuba tanks, but also far more complex and far less forgiving if something goes wrong. Dave didn't do things halfway. That was the first thing anyone who knew him would tell you. He was meticulous in his planning, relentless in his training, and absolutely fearless in execution. Not reckless, fearless. There's a difference. Reckless people ignore risk. Fearless people calculate it, accept it, and walk through it anyway. In October of 2004, Dave flew to South Africa with a single objective: dive to the bottom of Bushman's Hole and set a new world record for the deepest cave dive on a rebreather. His partner on the expedition was Don Shirley, a 48-year-old South African technical diver based in Johannesburg. Don was everything Dave was not, at least on the surface. Where Dave was warm and talkative, Don was reserved. Where Dave laughed easily, Don measured his words like a man who'd learned that saying less was almost always safer than saying more. He was stocky, gray-bearded, with thick forearms, and the kind of quiet intensity that made you pay attention when he spoke. Because when Don Shirley opened his mouth, it was never to fill silence. It was because he had something worth saying. But underwater, they were perfect together. Dave led with boldness. Don followed with precision. They had dived together dozens of times across South Africa's cave systems, and between them existed what divers call depth trust, the kind of bond that only forms when two people have repeatedly placed their lives in each other's hands in total darkness. On the first exploratory dive, Dave descended to 271 meters. His helmet-mounted light swept across the flat stone floor at the bottom of the cavern. Fine sediment billowed up like fog in the beam, every small movement stirring a slow-motion cloud that hung suspended in the water. And then the light hit something that was not stone. A shape. A human shape. Lying on the rock, still wearing a full diving suit, tanks still strapped to the back, a guideline tangled around the legs. The body had not decomposed the way bodies normally do. At this depth, the cold temperatures and extreme pressure trigger a process called saponification. Body fat converts into a substance called adipocere, a waxy, soap-like material that encases the remains and preserves them in a strange, almost frozen state. The shape was intact, recognizable, but transformed. The skin replaced by something white, translucent and fragile, lighter than water. And, as Dave would soon learn, extremely dangerous when disturbed. Dave hovered there, 3 meters above the body, his light illuminating a dead man who had been lying in perfect darkness for a decade. He knew immediately who this was. Every diver in South Africa knew. 10 years earlier, on December 17, 1994, a young man named Deon Dreyer had dived into Bushman's Hole with a group of friends and never come back. Deon was 20 years old, born August 7, 1974, in Pretoria. The only son of Theo Dreyer, a quiet, hard-working civil engineer, the kind of man who said little but carried everything. And Marie Dreyer, a nurse at the local hospital, a woman with gentle hands and worried eyes who kept fresh flowers on the kitchen table and hummed softly when she cooked, as if music was the only thing holding her steady. Deon was the opposite of quiet. He was energy in human form, loud, curious, restless, the kind of kid who climbed every tree, jumped off every wall, and discovered diving at 16 like a man who'd been waiting his whole life to find water. He could talk for hours about partial pressures, frog kick technique, the beauty of underground spaces where sunlight never reached. He was better than his age, bolder than his experience, and more confident than his ability. In technical diving, they have a name for that combination. They call it the formula for disaster. That December day, Deon went deeper than planned, deeper than anyone in his group, deeper than his equipment was designed to handle. His friends waited at the surface. Every minute felt like an hour. When the maximum decompression window passed and Deon still hadn't surfaced, they knew. A rescue team was called, but at the depth where Deon had vanished, no diver in 1994 had the ability or the courage to follow. Deon Dreyer's body settled on the floor of Bushman's Hole, 271 meters below the surface, in a place where sunlight has never reached, where the silence is absolute, and where the darkness is so complete that it feels less like an absence of light and more like a presence of something else entirely. There was no body to bury, no funeral, no ending. On the rock face at the mouth of the hole, Theo and Marie placed a small bronze plaque. Deon Dreyer, July 8, 1974 to December 17, 1994. Beloved son, the water took you, but our love will never sink. 10 years. 10 Christmases without Deon. 10 birthdays where Marie still baked the rusk cake he loved, set it on the table, lit a candle, and sat watching the flame until the wax melted to nothing. His bedroom stayed exactly as he left it. Posters on the wall, books on the desk, sneakers under the bed. Marie cleaned it every week, as if he might walk through the door any moment. Theo did not speak about Deon. Not because he had forgotten, but because every time he heard his son's name, it felt like someone was reopening a wound that had never been allowed to heal. He coped through silence, a silence so heavy that Marie sometimes felt it had its own gravity, pulling everything in the house downward. Every year on December 17th, Marie drove more than 500 kilometers from Pretoria to Bushman's Hole. She stood at the edge, looked down at the still, dark water below, and she talked to her son. She told him about the garden, about the new dog, about the summer rains. She never said goodbye, because she never accepted that he was truly gone. She just said, "I'm still here, my boy. I'm still waiting." And the darkness below the water never answered. Dave Shaw broke the surface after his exploratory dive and pulled the regulator from his mouth. But he did not smile.
Don Shirley was waiting on the limestone shelf beside the water's edge, a towel draped over his shoulder, his logbook open on his knee, ready to record depths and times, the way he always did. Precise, methodical. The habits of a man who believed that discipline was the only thing standing between a diver and a coffin.
But when Don saw Dave's face, he closed the logbook. Something had changed. It was not the expression of a man who had just set a personal depth record. Don had seen that face before. The grin, the bright eyes, the adrenaline still buzzing behind the words. This was different. Dave's eyes were distant, focused on something that was no longer in front of him, but still very much inside him. He sat on the rock, peeled off his gloves, and stared at the still water for a long time before he spoke. "There's someone down there, Don." Don did not respond immediately. He set the logbook aside and waited, because he had learned over years of partnership that Dave processed things out loud, and the best thing you could do was give him room. "A body," Dave said. "On the bottom. Full dive kit. Tanks still on. Line wrapped around his legs." He paused. "He's covered in this white stuff. Adipocere, I think. And he looks intact. Like he just laid down and never got up." Dave turned to Don, and for the first time in all the dives they had shared, Don saw something in Dave's eyes that looked like grief for a stranger. "He looks young, Don. Too young to be down there alone for 10 years. Don knew who it was before Dave said the name. Every technical diver in South Africa knew the story of Deon Dreyer, the 20-year-old who went too deep in Bushman's Hole on a December afternoon in 1994 and never came back.
It was the cautionary tale that instructors told students, the ghost story that circled around campfires after dive trips, the name that hung over Bosman's hut like a quiet curse. But in 10 years, no one had ever confirmed seeing the body, because no one had ever gone deep enough to look. Until now. Dave said it plainly, the way pilots deliver difficult information. No drama, no build-up, just the fact laid bare on the table. "I want to bring him up." The silence between them stretched. The Kalahari wind pushed dust across the limestone, and somewhere far away, a bird called once and went quiet. Don looked at Dave, then looked at the hole, that small, unremarkable opening in the earth that swallowed people and held them. Then looked back at Dave. "You understand that no one has ever attempted a body recovery at that depth?" "I do." "You understand that transporting an object from 270 meters through 12 hours of decompression while managing gas switches and buoyancy and your own physiology is something that exists in theory and nowhere else?" "I do." "You understand that adipocere is lighter than water, and that the moment you disturb that body, you could trigger a chain reaction you cannot control. Sediment cloud, line tangle, buoyancy loss, any one of which could kill you before you even realize you're in trouble." Dave was quiet for a moment. He did not argue. He did not dismiss the risks. He simply said, "Don, I'm not asking you whether it's dangerous. I'm asking you whether you'll help me." Don Shirley looked out at the desert, the cracked earth, the thorn scrub, the horizon trembling in the heat. He had spent 3 decades diving in places where a single mistake meant death, and in all those years, he had survived by following one rule: never let emotion override judgment. But he also knew Dave Shaw, knew him the way you know someone whose breathing pattern you can recognize in the dark at 200 meters. And he understood that this was not impulse. Dave had seen something at the bottom of that hole that he could not unsee, and the only way to live with it was to act. "I'll help," Don said, "but I need you to understand something. I'm helping because I trust you, not because I believe this mission is possible." Dave nodded. He understood the distinction, and he accepted it. That evening, the 2 men sat outside the farmhouse where the expedition team was based, a low, whitewashed building with a corrugated iron roof and a stoop that faced west toward sunsets so wide they seemed to stretch beyond the edge of the world. The air had cooled, and the stars above the Kalahari were absurd in their density, the Milky Way so thick it looked like someone had spilled flour across black cloth. Dave had a satellite phone in his hand. He had spent the afternoon tracking down a number through a contact in the South African diving community, a retired instructor named Willem Roo, a short, sun-baked man with a permanent squint and decades of connections in the cave diving world, who had known the Dreyer family since before the accident. Willem had been reluctant at first.
He had seen what Deon's disappearance did to that family, and he was not eager to reopen the wound with false hope. But Dave convinced him. Not with promises, with the simple fact that he had been there, at the bottom, and he had seen the boy. Willem gave him the number. Dave dialed. The phone rang 4 times before a woman answered. Her voice was soft, cautious, the voice of someone who had learned long ago that phone calls after dark rarely bring good news. Mrs. Dreyer, my name is Dave Shaw. I'm a diver from Australia. I was at Bushman's Hole today, and I need to tell you something. Silence. I found your son. The silence that followed was so complete that Dave checked the screen to make sure the call was still connected. Then he heard it. Not a sob, not a wail, but a small, sharp sound, like something inside her had finally cracked after 10 years of bearing weight it was never meant to carry. You saw my boy? Marie Dreyer's voice came through broken, barely above a whisper. You really saw him? Yes, ma'am. I saw Deon. Another silence. Then she asked the question that Dave would carry with him for the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. Her voice trembled so badly he had to press the phone hard against his ear to hear. Does my son... Does he look like he was in pain? Dave closed his eyes. He thought of the body on the rock floor, the white adipocere skin, the diving suit still intact, the stillness of a place where nothing had moved for a decade. He could have said many things. He chose the kindest version of the truth he could find. He looks peaceful, Mrs. Dreyer. He looks like he's sleeping. He heard her crying quietly. Then the phone changed hands and a man's voice came through, flat, dry, stripped of inflection. The voice of a man who had built walls around his emotions with brick and mortar over 10 years and was not about to let a stranger's phone call bring them down. What do you want from us? Theo Dreyer asked. Dave answered with the words that would become both a prayer and a curse for everyone involved. I don't want anything from you. I'm calling to tell you that I am going to bring your son home. The line went dead silent. And then Theo Dreyer, the man who had not spoken his son's name in a decade, who had sealed every door and shuttered every window inside himself to survive the unsurvivable, made a sound that Marie would later describe not as crying, but as the sound of something that was finally allowed to collapse. After they hung up, Marie sat in the kitchen of their home in Pretoria, the same kitchen where Deon used to drop his school bag on the floor and raid the fridge, where his laughter once bounced off the tiles, where a vase of fresh flowers still stood on the table because Marie refused to let the house forget what life felt like. She sat there and stared at the phone and tried to understand what had just happened. A stranger from the other side of the world had called to say he had seen her dead son lying on a rock in the dark, and that he intended to bring him back. She did not know if this was a miracle or the beginning of another catastrophe. She turned to Theo, who was standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, as if he needed the house itself to hold him up. What if he fails? She said. What if he dies down there too? Another mother loses her son because of that hole. Theo was silent for what felt like a long time. Then he said the longest sentence he had spoken about Deon in 10 years. Then at least Deon won't be alone. Marie looked at her husband and could not tell if he was being truthful or breaking apart. Perhaps both. In the days that followed, Marie began doing something she had not done in years. She opened Deon's bedroom door, not just to clean, the way she always did, but to sit inside. She sat on his bed, surrounded by his things, the posters he had chosen, the books he had half read, the socks still curled under the bed frame. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine an ending. Not a happy one, just an ending. A funeral. A grave she could visit without driving 500 kilometers into the desert. A place where she could bring flowers instead of standing at the edge of a black hole and whispering into the void. She did not know yet that the cost of that ending would be higher than anything she had ever imagined. But on that October night, sitting in her dead son's bedroom with the phone still warm in her hand, Marie Dreyer felt something she had not felt in 10 years. Hope. And hope, in a story like this, is the most dangerous thing of all.
"3 months? That was how long Dave Shaw and Don Shirley spent building a plan for something that had never been done. A body recovery from 271 meters inside a flooded cave, using closed-circuit rebreathers, with a decompression obligation that would keep the lead diver suspended in the water column for more than 12 hours on the way back up.
There was no manual for this, no case study, no precedent anywhere in the history of technical diving. They were writing the procedure as they went, and both of them knew that if they got even one line wrong, the person who would pay for it was Dave. They worked from Don's base in Johannesburg, a cluttered workshop behind his house where dive equipment covered every surface, regulators hanging from hooks, oxygen analyzers on the workbench, stacks of laminated dive tables pinned to a corkboard alongside depth charts of every major cave system in southern Africa. Don's workshop smelled like neoprene and machine oil, and it was the kind of place where everything had a purpose, even if nothing had a proper place. He had spent 30 years accumulating gear and knowledge in equal measure, and both were visible in the organized chaos of that room. The plan they built was precise, layered, and unforgiving of error. Dave would descend to 271 meters carrying a custom body bag, a reinforced nylon sack with attachment points for a lift system, and a small inflatable buoyancy device that could be filled with gas from a separate cylinder to create enough lift to raise the body off the bottom. He would have a maximum of 20 minutes at depth. Every additional minute beyond that would add hours to his decompression schedule on the ascent, compounding the risk of oxygen toxicity, CO2 buildup in the rebreather loop, and hypothermia from the cold water. In those 20 minutes, he had to locate the body, which he had seen on the exploratory dive but which might have shifted in the current, maneuver it into the bag, secure the straps, inflate the lift device, and begin his ascent. It was, by any reasonable measure, an impossible timeline. Dave did not consider it impossible. He considered it tight. Don would serve as the deepest support diver, stationed at 220 meters, 51 meters above the bottom, but still deeper than 99% of divers on Earth would ever go. His role was critical. He would be the first person Dave saw on the way up, the checkpoint that confirmed Dave was conscious, functioning, and ascending on schedule. If something went wrong below 220, Don was the last line of intervention. If something went wrong above 220, the support team would take over. 8 additional divers, each handpicked by Don from the South African cave diving community, would be positioned at intervals throughout the water column, from 150 meters to the surface, each carrying spare gas cylinders and emergency equipment. Among them was a wiry, soft-spoken Afrikaner named Dusan Stojakovic, a 36-year-old dive instructor from Cape Town with cropped blonde hair and a reputation for staying calm in situations that made other divers panic. Dusan would hold the 150-meter station, the deepest of the support positions after Don, and he had volunteered without hesitation when Don described the mission, not because he thought it was safe, but because he believed that if Dave Shaw was willing to die for a stranger's son, the least he could do was be there to help him survive. Dave also decided to mount a small video camera on his helmet. He wanted the entire dive recorded, every second from descent to recovery to ascent. It was partly the pilot in him. Aviators document everything, because in aviation, what you don't record is what kills the next crew. But it was also something more personal. Dave believed that if he succeeded, the footage would become one of the most significant documents in cave diving history. Proof that the impossible was possible. That a promise made to a grieving mother could be kept, even at the edge of human capability. He did not say what the footage would become if he failed. He did not need to. Everyone understood. The plan was shared with the international diving community, and the reaction was immediate and severe. Online forums that served as gathering places for technical divers erupted with debate. Some praised Dave's courage. Many more questioned his judgment. A well-known British cave diver named Andrew Friedman, a tall, angular man in his 50s with a clipped accent and a blunt manner that had earned him both respect and enemies in the diving world, posted a lengthy analysis on the largest technical diving forum. His conclusion was devastating in its clarity. Dave Shaw is an exceptional diver, but this mission is not about skill. It is about physics, and physics does not care how good you are. Friedman's specific concern, shared by nearly every expert who weighed in, was the adipocere. The waxy substance encasing Deon Dreyer's body was lighter than water. As long as it remained undisturbed on the cave floor, it was stable. But the moment Dave attempted to move the body, to lift it, to shift it into the bag, to manipulate limbs that had been locked in position for a decade, the adipocere would react unpredictably. The body could surge upward with sudden buoyancy, dragging lines and equipment into a tangle. Sediment would billow from the floor in a blinding cloud, reducing visibility to 0 in seconds. And in that zero visibility environment, at 271 meters, with a rebreather system that depended on precise breathing patterns to manage CO2, Dave would have perhaps 3 to 4 minutes before the carbon dioxide in his breathing loop reached dangerous levels. 3 to 4 minutes sounded like a reasonable window. It was not. Don Shirley explained it to Dave in a private conversation that Don later recounted to a journalist. Dave, if the adipocere causes the body to float and your lines get tangled, you'll have 3 to 4 minutes before the CO2 in your loop crosses the danger threshold. But at 270 meters, in the dark, with sediment everywhere, 3 minutes is not 3 minutes. It's seconds. Your fine motor skills are already compromised by pressure. Your brain is already working at reduced capacity from the gas mix. You won't have time to think your way out. You'll either cut free instantly, or you won't cut free at all. Dave listened. He nodded, and then he said, I made a promise, Don. Don looked at him for a long time, the kind of look that held everything he wanted to say and everything he knew would be useless to say. And then he spoke the words that he would remember for the rest of his life. Should a promise to the living be paid with the life of the living? Dave did not answer, or perhaps his silence was the answer. Meanwhile, in Pretoria, Marie Dreyer was learning the details of the plan, not from Dave, who had kept his communications with her warm and reassuring, but from the internet, where the diving community's alarm had spilled into public forums and news articles. She read the depth figures. She read the decompression times. She read Andrew Friedman's analysis and understood enough of it to feel the blood drain from her face. She called Dave on a Tuesday evening, and her voice was shaking before she finished his name. Dave, if the worst happens, then Deon will not just have taken his own life. He will have taken yours. Your wife will lose her husband. Your children will lose their father. Because of my son. I cannot live with that. Dave was quiet on the line. When he spoke, his voice carried the gentleness of a man who has made peace with his own decision and no longer needs anyone else to validate it. Mrs. Dreyer, this is my choice. I'm not doing this because you asked me to. I'm doing it because I saw your son, and I can't turn my back on him. If something happens to me, that is my responsibility, not your burden. Marie hung up and told Theo what Dave had said. Theo sat in the kitchen, in the chair he always sat in, the one facing the window, the one where he could look at the garden without looking at anyone, and he was silent for a long time. Then he said something that Marie almost did not recognize as her husband's voice, because it carried an emotion she had not heard from him in years. Not grief, not anger, but something rawer, something closer to need. If he brings Deon home, it's not just bones he's bringing back. It's permission. Permission to end this. It's been 10 years, Marie. 10 years, we haven't been allowed to end it. Marie reached across the table and took his hand. Theo did not pull away. He did not squeeze back either. He simply let her hold it, the way a man lets someone touch a wound, not because it helps, but because refusing would require more energy than he had left. Outside, the Pretoria evening settled in. Warm air, the smell of jasmine from the neighbor's fence, the distant sound of a dog barking twice and then going quiet. Everything ordinary, everything continuing. And somewhere in that ordinary evening, two parents sat in their kitchen holding hands, waiting for a stranger on the other side of the world to either bring their son home or join him at the bottom.
January 8, 2005. The Kalahari dawn broke clean and sharp, the sky a sheet of pale glass stretching from horizon to horizon without a single cloud.
The air was still cool at 6 in the morning, but you could already feel the heat waiting, pressing against the edges of the darkness like something impatient. By midday it would be brutal, but by midday, everything would already be over. At the mouth of Bushman's Hole, the expedition team had been in position since before first light. Equipment cases lay open on the limestone shelf. Cylinders of trimix and oxygen stood in rows like sentries.
Radios crackled with status checks from the support divers already descending into the water column, each one dropping to their assigned depth and clipping onto the guideline that ran like a lifeline from the surface down, into the dark. The bronze memorial plaque for Deon Dreyer caught the first angle of sunlight and threw a small flare of gold across the gray rock, as if the metal itself was trying to say something. 8 support divers were in the water. Dusan Stojakovic held the 150-meter station, breathing slow and steady, his light pointed downward into nothing. Below him, at intervals of 20 to 30 meters, others waited, each one a link in a chain designed to bring Dave Shaw safely back to the surface.
At the deepest support position, 220 meters beneath the morning sky, Don Shirley hovered alone in water so cold it burned, and so dark that his headlamp created a sphere of light roughly 2 meters across, beyond which the world simply ceased to exist. He checked his watch. He checked his gas. He checked his watch again. And he waited for the sound of Dave's bubbles descending past him. On the surface, Dave stood at the water's edge. He was already fully kitted. Rebreather unit on his back, bailout cylinders clipped to his harness, the custom body bag rolled and secured to a D-ring on his left hip, the inflation device for the lift system strapped to his right thigh. The helmet camera was on, its small red recording light blinking steadily. He ran through his pre-dive checks the way he ran through pre-flight checks in a cockpit, systematic, unhurried, each item confirmed out loud even though no one was listening. Regulator, functioning. O2 sensors, reading normal. Scrubber canister, fresh. Bailout valves, tested. He went through every piece of equipment with the discipline of a man who understood that at 271 meters, the margin between life and death was measured in millimeters of valve tolerance and seconds of reaction time. When the checks were done, Dave looked up at the sky, a habit from 30 years of flying, the automatic glance upward that every pilot makes before committing to a departure, as if asking the heavens for clearance one last time. The sky gave nothing back. Just blue, endless blue, the kind that makes you feel very small and very temporary. He stepped into the water. The descent took 11 minutes. Dave dropped through the water column at a controlled rate, the walls of the cavern widening around him as he passed through the narrow entrance and into the cathedral-like chamber below. Sunlight filtered through the first 30 meters, blue-green, luminous, beautiful, and then it was gone. From 30 meters onward, there was only his headlamp, a cone of white light punching into darkness that swallowed it within meters. At 100 meters, the pressure was 11 times surface atmospheric. At 150, he passed Dusan, exchanging a brief hand signal. Okay, going down. Okay, acknowledged. And continued sinking. At 200, he waved to another support diver, whose name he had learned only 3 days ago. At 220, he swept past Don Shirley, their eyes meeting for a fraction of a second through their masks. Dave flashed the OK sign. Don returned it. Neither man smiled. At 250, Dave's hands began to tremble. High-pressure nervous syndrome, the body's protest against depths it was never designed to reach. At 260, the trembling was in his arms and jaw. At 270, the stone floor materialized below him like a gray planet emerging from fog, and fine sediment rose in slow-motion plumes wherever the pressure wave of his descent disturbed the bottom. There, exactly where he had seen it 3 months ago, lay the body of Deon Dreyer. Unchanged, undisturbed, still wearing his dive suit, still covered in that pale, waxy adipocere that made him look less like a corpse and more like a figure carved from soap. The tank was still on his back. The guideline was still tangled around his legs. 10 years and 23 days on the floor of the deepest hole in Africa, and the boy looked like he had been placed there yesterday. Dave approached. The camera recorded everything. He unrolled the body bag, positioned it beside Deon, and began the careful process of maneuvering the body into the sack. He worked methodically, one limb at a time, shifting weight, adjusting position, the way he did everything, with precision, with patience, with control. And then everything collapsed. The moment Dave lifted the torso, the adipocere reacted. The waxy coating, lighter than the surrounding water, generated sudden buoyancy that no simulation had predicted and no planning had accounted for. The body surged upward off the rock floor with a force that jerked Dave's arms and dragged his lines with it. Sediment exploded from the bottom in a blinding white cloud that swallowed his headlamp beam entirely. In less than 2 seconds, visibility went from 3 meters to 0. Dave could not see his own hands. The camera footage from this point is chaos. Swirling sediment, wildly sweeping light, bubbles spiraling in every direction, and tangled in the middle of it, Dave's guideline, his light cable, the body bag straps, the inflation hose. All of it knotted around the body that was now floating and spinning in the silt cloud, like something alive and fighting. Dave's hands appeared in the frame, pulling at lines, twisting, trying to cut free with the shears clipped to his harness. But every movement stirred more sediment and tightened the tangle further. And the audio. The audio is what haunts anyone who has ever listened to it. Dave's breathing through the rebreather, normally a steady rhythmic hiss, changed. It became faster, shallower, more urgent. Each rapid breath produced more carbon dioxide. The rebreather's chemical scrubber, designed to absorb CO2 and recycle clean gas, was being overwhelmed by the volume and rate. Carbon dioxide began accumulating in the breathing loop. At surface pressure, elevated CO2 causes headache and confusion. At 271 meters of pressure, it is an anesthetic first and a poison second. The transition from one to the other happens without warning. Dave's hands slowed. The pulling became weaker. The frantic movements gave way to something sluggish, disoriented. A man fighting not an entanglement anymore, but his own fading consciousness. The camera recorded his right hand reaching for the line shears one last time, missing, reaching again, and then stopping. The last image the camera captured before Dave Shaw ceased all movement was this. His left hand, still gripping the haul line attached to Deon Dreyer's body bag. He had not let go. Even as the CO2 stole his awareness, even as his brain shut down system by system, the way a building goes dark floor by floor, his hand held the line. Whether it was cadaveric spasm, the involuntary muscle lock that sometimes occurs at the moment of death, or whether it was will, pure and simple, no one would ever know. The breathing stopped. The camera kept recording for several more minutes, pointed at nothing, registering only the slow drift of sediment and the absolute silence of 271 meters. Dave Shaw was dead. 220 meters above, Don Shirley watched his dive computer and felt the truth before the numbers confirmed it. 15 minutes, the planned bottom time, passed. 20 minutes, the absolute maximum. 25. At 25 minutes, with no ascending light, no ascending bubbles, no sign of movement from below, Don knew. He knew the way you know when a phone rings at 3 in the morning. You know before you answer. He made a decision that violated every protocol he and Dave had established, every safety rule he had followed for 3 decades, and the last direct instruction Dave had given him. He began descending. 230 meters. 240. His body screamed, tremors through his hands, nausea rolling through his stomach, his vision narrowing as the HPNS clamped down on his nervous system. 250 meters. Through the thinning sediment cloud, he saw Dave's headlamp, a fixed point of light in the blackness, not bobbing, not sweeping, not moving at all. A lamp attached to a man who was no longer a man. Don Shirley stopped. He hovered there, 250 meters below the surface, looking down at the motionless light of his best friend. And he made the hardest choice of his life. Continue down to confirm what he already knew and risk dying beside him, or turn around and live with the knowledge that he chose himself. He turned around. Not because he was afraid, although he was, terribly, but because Dave had told him in a conversation months earlier that both men pretended was a joke and neither found funny. If I don't come up, don't come down for me. Don't turn one death into 2. Don began ascending, but the damage was already done. He had exceeded his planned depth by 30 meters, and his body was paying the price in a currency that could not be refunded. At 150 meters, his right arm went numb, completely, instantly, as if someone had disconnected it at the shoulder. Decompression sickness. Nitrogen bubbles forming in the blood vessels and nerve tissue, blocking flow, killing cells. His left leg began to spasm. His vision blurred until the numbers on his wrist computer were smears of light. Dusan Stoyakovich found him at 120 meters. Don was drifting, semi-conscious, his right arm hanging limp, his eyes open but unfocused, his breathing ragged. Dusan grabbed his harness and held him in place while signaling upward for assistance. Over the next 7 hours, the support team shepherded Don through every decompression stop, holding him steady, switching his gas, monitoring his breathing, feeding him pure oxygen through a dedicated mask. 7 hours suspended in cold, black water, unable to move properly, unable to speak, unable to do anything except hang there and know that his best friend was lying on the bottom, 270 meters below his fins, in the company of a dead boy he had promised to bring home. On the surface, the news moved through the ground crew like a current through water, silent, fast, and felt by everyone at once. The radio calls became quieter. The body language shifted. Faces that had been focused and professional now carried the specific kind of emptiness that Marie Dreyer recognized immediately, because she had seen it 10 years ago on this exact spot, standing at this exact hole, watching this exact water refuse to give someone back. Marie had driven to Bosmansgat that morning against Dave's explicit request. He had asked the Dryers to wait at a guest house in the nearest town, wanting to spare them the technical reality of what was about to happen. Theo had stayed behind, not because Dave asked him to, but because he could not bring himself to stand at that hole again.
Marie could not bring herself to stay away. She arrived before dawn, parked her car on the dirt track, and walked to the edge of the hole in the half-light, wearing the blue cardigan that Deon had given her for her birthday the year he died. A garment she had kept in his closet for a decade, and put on that morning without fully understanding why. She stood beside the bronze plaque. She watched the support crew work.
She watched the water, which was calm and dark and offered nothing. When the murmurs started, when the ground team began exchanging glances that said what their mouths would not, Marie felt the ground tilt beneath her the way it had tilted once before, on a December afternoon in 1994, when the same water had swallowed her son and returned only silence. She knelt on the warm limestone, placed both hands flat on the rock as if trying to hold on to the earth itself, and for the first time in 10 years, she did not speak to Deon. She spoke to Dave. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking on the second word. "I'm sorry. Because of my son." The water below her was still. The sun climbed higher. Somewhere far above, a hawk circled once and disappeared into the white sky. And at the bottom of Bushman's Hole, 271 meters beneath the woman who was apologizing for a death that had not yet been confirmed, Dave Shaw lay in the sediment beside the boy he had promised to bring home, his hand still gripping the line, his camera still recording nothing. And the silence was total. Dave Shaw lay on the floor of Bushman's Hole for 3 days.
271 meters below the surface, in water so cold and so dark that it might as well have been another planet. The man who had promised to bring a stranger's son home rested beside the boy he had come to save.
His headlamp was still on when the battery finally died sometime during the first night. And after that, there was nothing. No light, no sound, no movement. Just the slow drift of sediment settling back onto two figures on the stone, one old and one young. One who had chosen to be there, and one who had not, both held together by a hand that would not let go. On the surface, the hours after Dave's death were a chaos of quiet. The expedition's ground coordinator, a compact, weathered South African named Leonard Dreyer, no relation to Deon's family, a 54-year-old logistics specialist who had organized remote expeditions for mining companies before transitioning to dive support operations, managed the radios and the growing crowd of officials, journalists, and emergency personnel who began arriving at Bushman's hut within hours of the news. Verna had a face that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that surrounded the hole, and she spoke with the flat efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that emotion was a luxury you could not afford during an operation. She coordinated the retrieval of Don Shirley, managed the decompression support rotation, fielded calls from the police and the National Parks Authority, and quietly ensured that Marie Dreyer, who was sitting on a rock 10 meters from the hole's edge and refusing to move, had water and a blanket as the temperature dropped after sunset. Don Shirley broke the surface at approximately 1:15 in the afternoon on January 8th, after 7 hours of decompression that the support team later described as the longest of their lives. He was semi-conscious, shivering violently, his right arm hanging at his side like something that no longer belonged to him. Two support divers, Dusan Stojakovic and a broad-shouldered paramedic diver named Johan Lombard, a 41-year-old former military medic with a shaved head and the steady hands of a man who had treated gunshot wounds in combat zones, lifted Don out of the water and onto the limestone shelf. Johan cut away Don's harness, wrapped him in thermal blankets, and started an IV line while Dusan held Don's head and spoke to him in low, steady Afrikaans, words that nobody else could hear and that Dusan would never repeat. A helicopter arrived within the hour and flew Don to Mill Park Hospital in Johannesburg, where the doctors confirmed what the dive team already knew. The decompression sickness had caused permanent nerve damage to his right arm and partial damage to his left leg. The nitrogen bubbles that had formed in his blood vessels during the unauthorized descent to 250 meters had destroyed tissue that would never regenerate. Don Shirley, one of the most accomplished technical divers in South Africa, would never dive again. In his hospital room, a small, sterile space with a window that looked out onto a car park and a strip of brown grass, Don lay on his back and stared at the ceiling for hours at a time. The nurses noted that he did not speak, did not cry, did not sleep. He simply lay there, his left hand, the hand that still had feeling, gripping the bed rail with a force that left impressions in his palm. One of the nurses, a young woman named Tandiwe Molefe, a recent graduate with kind eyes and the instinct to recognize pain that had nothing to do with the body, asked him gently if he needed anything. Don turned his head toward her, and the expression on his face was one she would later describe to a colleague as the look of a man who had left something behind in a place he could never return to. He said one sentence. "I need to know if Dave finished." Tandiwe did not know what he meant. She assured him the doctors were doing everything they could. Don turned back to the ceiling and said nothing more. 40 kilometers away, at Bushman Hole, Marie Dreyer did not leave. January 9th came, and she was still there, sitting on the same rock, wrapped in the same blanket Verna had given her, watching the same still water. She slept in her car that night, the seat reclined, the windows cracked open to let in the desert air that smelled of dust and dry grass, and nothing else. She ate the bread and bottled water that the remaining ground crew shared with her. She did not explain why she stayed. She did not need to. Everyone understood, even if no one said it. She had spent 10 years leaving this place, and she was done leaving. Theo called her on the morning of January 10th. His voice was hard, the way it got when he was trying to hold something together by compressing it. "Come home, Marie. There's nothing there for you." Marie held the phone against her ear and looked at the hole, that small, absurd opening in the flat earth that had taken her son and now taken the man who tried to bring him back. 10 years ago I said that to myself, she told Theo. I was wrong. Deon is there, and now Dave is there. I'm not leaving again. Theo was silent for a long time. Then he hung up. Marie was not sure if he was angry or broken or simply out of words. Perhaps all three. The technical team maintained a presence at the site, monitoring the underwater sensor equipment that had been installed during the expedition. There was a thin, almost irrational hope that the inflation system Dave had carried might somehow self-activate. A delayed gas release that could generate enough buoyancy to lift the bodies off the bottom. More realistically, some members of the team speculated that the natural process of adipocere buoyancy, which had caused the initial crisis, might continue to build until the body of Deon, and with it, Dave, began to rise on its own. It was physics, not faith, but at 271 meters, in a place that defied ordinary physics at every turn, even the scientists were not sure what to expect. Nobody expected what happened on the third day. January 11th, 2005. Early morning. The sun was barely above the horizon, painting the Kalahari in shades of copper and gold, when a support diver named Peter Herbst descended to the 50-meter mark on a routine equipment retrieval dive. Herbst was 39 years old, lean and methodical, a dive instructor from Bloemfontein who had volunteered for the expedition because he believed in what Dave was trying to do, and because he could not stand the idea of leaving gas cylinders and guideline reels in the water like debris at a grave. He had been making these dives every morning since January 8th, swimming down to collect equipment, checking the guideline, and returning to the surface with whatever he could carry. On this morning, as Herbst reached the 50-meter station and swept his light downward into the deep water below, he saw something moving. Two shapes, rising slowly from the darkness, rotating gently in the water column, drifting upward with the unhurried buoyancy of objects that have been released from the bottom and are in no hurry to reach the top. Herbst swam closer. His light illuminated the shapes, and what he saw made him grab the nearest anchor line with both hands to steady himself. Two bodies, ascending together. Dave Shaw, still in full dive kit, helmet camera still mounted, rebreather still on his back, every piece of equipment exactly where it had been when he entered the water 3 days ago. And beside him, partially enclosed in the body bag that Dave had carried down, connected to Dave by the haul line that was still locked in Dave's left hand, Deon Dreyer. The adipocere that had caused the catastrophe had, over 3 days, continued to generate buoyancy. Slowly, incrementally, the waxy substance that was lighter than water had lifted Deon's body off the bottom. And because Dave's hand had never released the line, whether through cadaveric spasm or through something that science cannot name. Dave had risen with him. Two men, one who had been dead for 3 days, one who had been dead for 10 years, rising together from the deepest hole in Africa, as if they had agreed somewhere in the darkness that it was time to go home. Herbst keyed his radio. His voice, when it came through the speaker on the surface, was shaking so badly that Leonard Dreyer had to ask him to repeat himself. He said it again, slower this time, each word deliberate. 2 bodies ascending. Both of them. Together. On the surface, the words hit the ground crew like a physical force. People stopped moving. Radios went silent. Someone dropped a clipboard, and the sound of it hitting the limestone was the loudest thing in the world for a full 3 seconds. Marie Dreyer was sitting on her rock, a cup of coffee in her hands that had gone cold an hour ago, when she heard the commotion. She stood up, set the cup on the ground with a care that seemed absurd given the circumstances, and walked to the edge of the hole. She watched as the support team, Herbst, Dushan, Johann, and 2 others, carefully guided the 2 bodies to the surface and lifted them onto the limestone shelf. Dave Shaw and Deon Dreyer, side by side. Dave's hand still on the line, Deon's body still in the bag. The older man and the younger man, the pilot and the boy, the keeper of promises and the reason the promise was made, lying together on the warm rock in the morning sun, as if one had simply walked the other home from a place where neither of them belonged. Marie walked to where they lay. She knelt on the stone, and her knees hit the rock with a sound that made Johann wince, but she did not seem to feel it. She looked at the body bag that held her son, the son she had been talking to through dark water for a decade, and she placed both hands on it, palms flat, fingers spread, as if she were touching his face through the fabric. She did not cry. She had exhausted that 3 days ago. She simply knelt there, hands on the bag, and whispered. The nearest diver, a young man standing 2 meters away, could not make out most of it, but he heard the last part clearly because her voice rose just enough to carry, "You're home. Both of you are home." In Johannesburg, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, Don Shirley's phone rang. He answered with his left hand. His right arm lay on the mattress beside him, unresponsive, a limb that would never again hold a dive light or turn a valve or grip a guideline in the dark. The call was from Leonard Dreyer at the surface station. She spoke for less than 30 seconds. Don listened without interrupting. When the call ended, he placed the phone on his chest, closed his eyes, and was still for so long that Tandiwe Molefe, who was checking his IV, leaned in to make sure he was breathing. His eyes opened. They were wet, the first time since he had been admitted that anyone had seen moisture in them. He looked at Tandiwe and said 4 words. Dave kept his promise. Then he turned his face to the wall and did not speak again for the rest of the day. The hospital room was quiet. The car park outside the window was filling with the morning rush. Johannesburg carried on. Traffic, noise, life, all the ordinary machinery of a city that did not know or care that 400 kilometers away, in the middle of a desert, 2 dead men had just risen from the deepest darkness on the continent and come home together. On February 5, 2005, under a sky so blue it looked painted, Deon Theodore Dreyer was buried at a small cemetery on the outskirts of Vryburg, a quiet farming town in the northwest province where his grandparents had been laid to rest decades earlier.
The cemetery sat on a gentle slope overlooking fields of dry grass and cattle fences, with a row of jacaranda trees along the western wall that in spring would bloom purple but on this summer afternoon, simply provided shade for the 37 people who had come to say goodbye to a boy who had been gone for 10 years and 23 days.
The funeral was modest. Marie had insisted on that. No media, no spectacle. Just the people who had known Deon. Childhood friends, now in their 30s, some with children of their own who squirmed in the pews. A few of his old diving companions, gray-haired men in ill-fitting suits who stood at the back and did not make eye contact with each other. A handful of neighbors from the Pretoria house, and Marie's sister, a thin, quiet woman named Elsa Botha, who had flown in from Cape Town and who held Marie's hand throughout the service with the fierce grip of someone who understood that letting go, even of a hand, was something this family had learned to fear. The pastor was a young man named Reverend Andries van Wyk, newly assigned to the parish, earnest and slightly nervous, who had never met Deon, but who spoke about him with a sincerity that made Marie nod slowly from the front row. Marie placed one item on the casket before it was lowered, a dog-eared paperback about cave diving that Deon had been reading the week he died. It had sat on his bedside table for 10 years, its bookmark, a torn strip of newspaper, still wedged at page 114. She had photocopied the book months ago, keeping the copy for herself and giving the original back to her son. It was, she told Elsa the night before, the last thing Deon had touched in his bedroom, and it should be the last thing that touched him. Theo stood at the lectern. He wore a dark suit that Marie had pressed that morning, and he gripped the edges of the wooden stand with both hands as if it were the only thing keeping him vertical. He did not read from notes. He spoke from a place that had been sealed shut for a decade and was only now, in the presence of a casket that held what remained of his only child, beginning to open. His voice did not tremble, but not because he was restraining himself. It was because for the first time in 10 years, speaking about Deon did not feel like bleeding. It felt like breathing. 10 years, he said. 10 years I could not say goodbye, because there was no one to say it to. Today, because of a man braver than I will ever understand, my son has a place to rest, and I can finally say what I should have said before he left that morning. Goodbye, Deon. I am proud of you, and I am sorry. Sorry that it took me 10 years to say it. He stepped down from the lectern and walked back to Marie, who took his arm and held it, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, they leaned into each other like two walls that had been standing separately and only now discovered they were stronger together. 11 days later, on the other side of the Indian Ocean, Dave Shaw was laid to rest in Australia. The service was held at a church in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, a brick building with stained glass windows that threw colored light across the pews in the late afternoon. Dave's wife, Anne Shaw, a small, composed woman with auburn hair turning silver at the temples, who had spent 30 years married to a man who flew planes and dove into holes, and who had learned to live with fear the way other wives learned to live with snoring, sat in the front row with their 2 adult children. The church was full. Pilots in uniform, divers in dark suits, colleagues, friends, neighbors, people who had known Dave in one of his many lives, the aviation life, the diving life, the family life, and who were only now understanding that all of those lives had been the same life, driven by the same impulse. Go where others won't, do what others can't, and never leave someone behind if there is anything you can do to bring them home. Don Shirley flew from Johannesburg against his doctor's explicit advice. He arrived in a wheelchair, pushed by a hospital aide he had hired for the trip, a young Zimbabwean man named Tendai, quiet and strong, who helped Don from the car to the chair to the church entrance without a word, understanding instinctively that this was not a day for conversation. Don's right arm lay motionless in his lap. His left leg was braced. His face carried the hollow, carved-out look of a man who had lost weight he did not have to spare. But he was there. That was what mattered. He had told Tendai on the flight, "I couldn't go down to get him. The least I can do is show up to say goodbye." Don did not deliver a eulogy. He did not stand. He simply asked Tendai to wheel him to the front of the church, where the casket sat draped in white, and he placed upon it a single object, the headlamp that Dave had worn on his final dive. It had been recovered with Dave's body when the 2 men floated to the surface together. The battery had long since died, but the lamp itself was intact, waterproof to 300 meters, designed to function in the most hostile environment on Earth, built to bring light into absolute darkness. It seemed to those watching like exactly the right thing to leave with Dave. Don leaned close to the casket. The people in the first 3 rows could hear him, barely, his voice a low rasp, stripped of everything except the words themselves. You took the light down into the dark, and you didn't bring it back because you left it with someone who needed it more. He sat back in his wheelchair, and Tendai rolled him to the side of the church, where Don remained for the rest of the service, his left hand resting on his motionless right arm, his eyes fixed on the casket, his face unreadable. Months later, in an interview with a South African journalist, a middle-aged woman named Liesl Hartman, a careful, patient reporter who had covered the Bushman Hole story from the beginning and who had earned Don's trust by never sensationalizing what had happened. Don was asked whether he regretted his decision to descend beyond his planned depth in the attempt to reach Dave. The question hung in the air of Don's living room in Johannesburg, a room that still had dive equipment stacked in the corner, but that now felt more like a museum than a workshop. Don was silent for a long time. Then he said, I regret that I didn't go deeper. I regret that I turned around. I know it was the right decision. Dave told me to, and if I had died, there would have been 3 bodies instead of 2. But right and bearable are 2 different things. I live with the right decision that I cannot bear every day. Liesl asked him what he thought about the 2 bodies rising together. Don looked toward the window, toward the sky, which was the pale gray of a Johannesburg winter, and spoke slowly, choosing each word the way he had always chosen them. I don't believe in miracles. I believe in physics. Adipocere is lighter than water. The body bag trapped gas. Buoyancy eventually overcame gravity. All of it is explainable. He paused. And Dave's hand still holding the haul line after 3 days? Cadaveric spasm. Involuntary muscle contraction at the moment of death, locking the hand in position. Medical science. Clear explanation. Another pause, longer this time. But you ask me what I think? I think Dave kept his promise, and I don't need physics or medicine to explain that. In Pretoria, in the weeks following the funeral, Marie Dreyer finally changed Deon's room. She did not let go. She hated that phrase with a precision that surprised even her. She rearranged. She kept the photocopied dive book. She kept one poster, the one Deon had hung himself, slightly crooked, above his desk. She donated the rest to a youth adventure sports organization in Pretoria, a small charity run out of a church basement that equipped underprivileged teenagers with hiking and climbing gear. She folded Deon's clothes into boxes, sealed them with tape, and stored them in the garage. She washed the sheets one last time, stripped the bed, and left the mattress bare. The room was not empty. It was changed. And that, Marie decided, was not the same as erased. She stopped driving to Bushman Hole on December 17th. For the first time in a decade, she did not make the 500-kilometer journey to stand at the edge of a hole and speak into water that never answered. Instead, she drove 15 minutes to the cemetery in Vryburg, where Deon's grave sat beneath one of the jacaranda trees, and she brought flowers, proteas, the national flower, because Deon had once told her they looked like aliens, and she had laughed so hard she spilled her tea. She talked to him there, in the sunlight, with birds singing and the wind moving through the branches, and for the first time, she did not feel like she was speaking into a void. She felt like she was speaking to her son. But Marie added a new ritual. Every year, on January 8th, the anniversary of Dave Shaw's death, she sat at her kitchen table and wrote a letter. She addressed it to Anne Shaw in Australia, and she mailed it without fail. The letters were never long. She did not know how to write enough. She only wrote, "Thank you and I'm sorry. Every year I don't know which word is heavier." Anne Shaw never wrote back. Marie did not blame her. Some debts cannot be acknowledged, because acknowledging them would mean accepting that they exist, and some things are too large to accept. Marie understood that. She mailed the letters anyway. On the rock face at the mouth of Bushman's Hole, beside the bronze plaque that Theo and Marie had placed for Deon in 1994, there now sits a second plaque. Smaller, simpler, placed by the diving community in the months following the tragedy. It reads, Dave Shaw, 1954 to 2005. Pilot, diver, promise keeper. Below those words, someone, no one has ever confirmed who, scratched a single line into the rock with a knife or a nail, in handwriting that is neither neat nor careless, but simply human. He went down, so someone else could come home. Bushman's Hole is still 282 meters deep. The water is still black. The Kalahari Desert is still dry and indifferent, and older than any story that humans tell each other around fires, or in hospital rooms, or at funerals where the wrong person is in the box. Occasionally, a new diver arrives at the hole, young, confident, hungry for depth, carrying equipment that did not exist in 2005, and ambitions that have existed since the first human looked into dark water and wondered what was at the bottom. They stand at the edge and look down. They see the still surface, clear and inviting. They see the vertical walls dropping away into blue that darkens to black. They see a record waiting, a story waiting, a test of everything they believe about themselves. They do not see Dave Shaw. They do not see Deon Dreyer. They do not see the line, thin as a guideline, transparent as water, invisible until you have already crossed it, between courage and madness, between a promise and a death sentence, between the place where humans can go and the place where humans should not. But the hole knows. The hole has always known. And the hole waits. Was Dave Shaw a hero or a man who let a promise drag him to the bottom? Was Don Shirley right to turn around? Or will he carry the weight of that turn for the rest of his life? Was Marie Dreyer healed? Or did she simply trade one wound for another? The wound named, "My son is gone," for the wound named, "A stranger died because of my son." And the promise, the most beautiful thing one person can offer another, is it worth more than a life? Boatman's hut does not answer. Boatman's hut is just 282 meters deep, and it waits.
Dave Shaw was not a superhero. He was a pilot, a husband, a father, a man who woke up every morning and went to work like the rest of us. But when he saw someone lying alone in the dark, forgotten by the world, he could not walk away. He made a promise, and he kept it, even when keeping it cost him everything.
Most of us will never dive to 270 meters. Most of us will never face that kind of danger. But every single day, we face smaller versions of the same choice. Do we keep the promises we make, even when it gets hard? Do we show up for the people who need us, even when it is inconvenient? Do we choose to be the person who stays, or the person who walks past? You do not need to risk your life to keep a promise. Sometimes keeping a promise is as simple as calling your mother back, showing up when you said you would, telling someone you love them before it is too late, the way Theo Dreyer wished he had told Deon one more time. The world does not need more heroes. It needs more people who keep their word. If this story touched something inside you, I ask you to share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep telling stories that matter, stories about real people who remind us what it means to be human. And if you believe that promises matter, that love is stronger than darkness, and that no one should ever be left behind, type Amen in the comments. For Dave, for Deon, for every person who has ever kept a promise when it would have been easier to walk away.
May God bless every single one of you watching this. Stay safe, keep your promises, And never forget that the light you carry into someone else's darkness is the most important light you will ever hold. I will see you in the next story.